Check, 1, 2. Okay, good evening. Good evening. We're just going to jump into it tonight, I guess. Does that sound okay? If you have your Bibles, I invite you to turn with me to Daniel chapter 11. If you'll remember, the last time we were in Daniel chapter 11, it was quite the history lesson. And this is the tail end of Daniel chapter 11. And there's a shift. I stopped the last lesson about where the break or the shift is, which is around verse 36, which is where we'll be picking up tonight. Now, let me say this before I go forward tonight. I will be sharing with you tonight not the popular majority view and understanding of the tail end of Daniel chapter 11. The popular majority view of this is that Daniel chapter 11, beginning in verse 36 and following, is that this section of Scripture pertains only to the final capital A Antichrist at the end of time. And I will fully acknowledge that that may be the correct interpretation and that what I'm teaching you tonight is not correct. However, I don't know how much that truly matters in the triage of theology. I think there are very important first-tier things like who Jesus Christ is, God in human form, the finer points of eschatology, which is the study of end things and the interpretation of this particular section. Now, what I'll probably vie for in the end is that, remember earlier on when we were looking at some sections of Daniel and I said, these antichrists are types of the final Antichrist, because I do wholeheartedly think that there is a Antichrist that will come at the end of time and will be sort of the opposite in Satan's placement of trying to ape who Christ is. It was an interesting thing as I was preparing today in looking and seeing what others had written. I came across a study on how pastors thought and felt about the Antichrist, capital A. And I'm not sure how old this study is. It was one that Lifeway did a few years ago. If you'd like to look it up for yourself later, the title of this Lifeway research article is called Pastors, the End of the World is Complacent. Most Protestant pastors believe Jesus will return in the future, the article says, but few agree about the details of the apocalypse. A third of Americans, Protestant pastors, expect Christians to be raptured or taken up in the sky to meet Jesus as the end times begin. About half think a false Messiah known as the Antichrist will appear sometime in the future. A surprising number think the Antichrist has already been here or isn't on his way at all. About half, 49%, say the Antichrist is a figure who will arise in the future. Others say there is no individual, and the Antichrist, this is the minority, 12%, that he's just the personification of evil or an institution, 7% said that. 6% say the Antichrist has already been here. Baptists, 75%, and Pentecostals, 83%, are the most likely to see a future Antichrist, and I personally believe that there is an Antichrist coming in the end. I'm in that category. Lutherans, 29%, Methodists, 28%, and Presbyterians, Reformed pastors, 31%, are more likely to see Antichrist as a personification of evil. Education also played a role in how pastors view the Antichrist. Two-thirds of those with no college degree, 68%, were a bachelor's, 63%, believe in a future Antichrist figure. Fewer than half of those with masters, 39%, or a doctoral, 49%, hold that view. I guess I'm in the fewer view. So there we go. So that was just interesting information to see. All right. We're going to just do kind of a quick look back in 11 here. As I said before, I think that what we were looking at in chapter 11 up to this point was the intertestamental conflict and period. Daniel very much likes to run his prophecy sections in kingdoms of 4. And I think we're entering into here another kind of section of the 4th kingdom here. And then chapter 12 will be the 5th kingdom. And I think the 5th kingdom is the kingdom of the Messiah. All right? So that's what we're kind of dealing with here. There's a break within these verses between 36 and the rest, although in some ways they contextually seem to flow together. They don't fit historically with the events that happened in the Inter-Maccabean period, and so they're just different, beginning with that shift in verse 36. So, with that in mind, let's look at this together. Daniel 11, verse 36. By the way, if I'm wrong about this and you disagree with me, you can arm wrestle me whenever we're done. Okay? Does that sound good? All right. You don't want to arm wrestle?
That's their definition of a pro wrestler.
Yeah, that's it. That's right.
Struggling actor.
All right. Okay, here we go. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by woman. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these, a God whom his fathers did not know. He shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses, with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him he shall load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and many ships, and he shall come into the countries, and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall. But these shall be delivered out of the hands, Edom and Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become rulers of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and Liberians and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devour many to destruction. And he shall pitch his partial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. He shall come to his end with none to help him. All right. That's God's holy, inerrant, infallible word. Let's get into it. First of all, as I said, Daniel has constantly throughout this prophetic section concentrated on 4 kingdoms. And those 4 kingdoms, for a quick review, does anybody remember what they were? Babylon, Mede-Persian, Greek, and Roman. That's right. He has shown us that several times over. We see a shift here in verse 36, where I began reading tonight. Following that describes, there's some parallels in some verses that sound similar to what we saw in chapter 8, but most commentators agree. This king and what is happening here is different than the king in the previous section in chapter 11. Some commentators, one Reformed commentator said this, from the Reformation time period. This is actually the Roman Empire. Of course, it's not completely impossible that it is the Roman Empire in the book of Daniel here, but I'm not totally convinced that, I think it was John Calvin wrote that. I'm not sure he's right on that one, and a few other points as well, but that's another discussion. Some people point out that there are parallels here in this passage to Paul in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. And Paul's writing in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is why I personally believe there will be an Antichrist at end times. I think Paul makes that case very clear. And I'm just not sure that what we're reading about in Daniel 11:36 is the same person Paul's describing in 2 Thessalonians as well. So I think this may be 2 different individuals. But I think the person in Daniel chapter 11 may be an archetype of the coming Antichrist. All right? Are you with me? So I know you're on the edge of your seat tonight and you're asking me, Pastor, who is this king in verse 36? Who do you think he is? If you don't think he's the capital A Antichrist at the end of the time, do tell us who you think he is, right? Any bets? Anybody want to say? No? Okay. I think that this Antichrist is part of the Jewish wars that were happening after Christ ascended to heaven. And there was one particularly vile of the 3 who were fighting for control in Jerusalem named John of Galicia, which is a province just outside of Galilee. Let me just share a few things about him, and you tell me what you think after reading this and see if we can put this all together here. He did a siege on Jerusalem from 66 to 70 AD. All right? So I want you to understand something. When we think about the ransacking of Jerusalem in 70 AD, we tend to think that the Romans did all the damage. That's just not true. The Jews were actually the ones who damaged Jerusalem themselves. Civil war erupted in Jerusalem between 66 and 70 AD. They were trying to overthrow their Roman overlords with these insurrections, and in the process of doing it, imagine this, God's people could not agree upon a leader. And so you had three factions in Jerusalem that were fighting for control. John's men, Simon was another one, and I don't think I wrote down the third fellow's name here, but the three of them fighting one another. Now, here was the reputation. Josephus, has anybody ever heard of him before? He's a famous Jewish historian. Josephus records and lived through all of the Jewish wars that happened, the Jewish civil wars. And he records for us what John was like from this little province right outside of Galilee as he went through. He tells us that he aspired, this is the words of Josephus, he aspired to despotic power among the Jews, and personally he was responsible for murdering the high priest in Jerusalem in 66 AD, and took the title of sovereign monarch for himself after doing so. Now, that doesn't sound very Jewish of him, does it? Sounds very self-infatuated, right? The Jewish state turned in on itself, and it is recorded that him and his band of men ransacked Jerusalem, went in, killing and murdering heads of household, raping women, and leaving women and children behind, fatherless and destitute. Josephus goes on to tell us that he saw plundering of Jerusalem. His men saw it as a sport. Now that sounds like the kind of guy you want to be with, doesn't it? He also goes on to further tell us about John and his not-so-very man of men, that they would dress up in women's clothing and paint their faces, and they would also use ointments. I guess it was another feminine product of the day, and they would engage in homosexual activity with one another. And they would parade this in the streets of Jerusalem. Interesting, isn't it? It all feels familiar, doesn't it? Sadly. Now, it says here he'll exalt himself. I think John matches that description. He'll magnify himself above every god and speak astonishing things against the God of gods. In the Jewish Wars book, section 4, 560, you can read all about that. To further talk about this, Josephus says they would ornament themselves. That he, it says here in the passage, he did not desire women. Apparently, his heart was turned for the lust of his own sex. John does here, he has a sense of nationalism. He wants to throw off the Roman garb, but I don't think he has any true fear of Yahweh, the God of Israel. To me, this character sounds self-exalting, this historic figure from Jewish history, and fits the bill of this passage and several of them that are here. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished for what is decreed. He shall pay no attention to the God of his fathers or to the ones beloved by women. That phrase, the God of his fathers, is used in the Old Testament about 60 times. And every time that passage and that section, that phraseology is used, it refers to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, which is another reason why I think that the person that is being described is of direct Jewish descent, because that phraseology is only ever tied to Jews who are biologically descended therefrom. All right, so let's talk about what happens here in this in this tale of John and heading towards the fortress. If you'll look here back at verse 31 for just a moment, under the Maccabean conflict and under the reign of terror that we studied last time, it said here that Antiochus forced him, the forces there, they will profane the temple and the fortress and shall take away the regular burnt offerings, and they shall set up an abomination of desolation. We talked about that last time. So it's been some time, that we're going to see the same kind of thing happen here, even though this is a different time frame. They're going to stop sacrifices during the Civil War period, and something interesting is going to happen. Verse 38, he shall honor the God of Fortness. What is he talking about here? Josephus records for us that the civil war that breaks out in Jerusalem eventually finds its home, and the worst of it, in the city. And what happens there is John and his men take the temple and they barricade themselves in the temple and fight from it as a fortress and use God's temple as a fortress to try to win their war with. While all this is happening, word gets back to Rome that there is infighting and insurrection against the Roman Empire. Now, you've got to keep in mind that if John has nudged himself into the temple in Jerusalem, and Simon and the other fellow who is trying to take control, they are trying to get in. What are they doing to the temple? They're setting it ablaze, and they're chipping away at it, and they're destroying their own temple. It's coming apart at the seams for God's people. Word gets back, right? The king of the south is mentioned in this passage. Tiberius Julius Alexander is who I think this is. Nero, appointed ruler of Egypt. The fourth kingdom's parallel to the tallies that we talked about last time. Egypt was, interestingly enough, whenever war would break out in Jerusalem, many times in the Old Testament, after the Passover, after the deliverance from Egypt, when God's people were under siege in Jerusalem or in the north, do you know where they would run and flee to? You know what country they would run to? They would run to Egypt. Egypt was their safe haven that they would go to. Tell me, where was it that Mary and Joseph went whenever they were trying to escape Herod? Where did they go? And the prophets always thought that was very ironic, that God's people would leave the promised land and escape to Egypt, which was the place that they were enslaved. The Bible tells us, though, in the passage today, that the route that they would have normally taken, because think about this. One thing I want you to remember is we're talking about time period 66 to 70 AD. There are probably, roughly estimated here, over 10,000 born-again Christians that live in Jerusalem at this time. And you're living in Jerusalem during a time of civil war, and you're watching these armies consume themselves here, right? What do you do? What do you do, right? Now, of course, I would argue that one thing in this war that is happening, there is a divine providence, because with Jerusalem being destroyed in this civil war, and eventually the Romans are going to roll into town and finish it, but what are they going to be forced to do? What are the Christians going to be? Because the Christians are not Jewish, really, right? And they're not Romans, right? They're really of neither party, are they? What are they going to do? They're going to leave, right? It's going to force them out into the other provinces and into other places. And I have more on that here in just a minute. So Egypt is not an escape route. The king of the north, Vespasian, was appointed by Nero, and his son Titus ruled in Galilee. And they are the rulers of Palestine. Eventually, what's going to happen is Vespasian is going to be installed as the next emperor of Rome. And what he will do is he will assign his son Titus, when word gets back of how bad the civil war in Jerusalem is, to go and shut it down. Okay? His job is to go and shut this little skirmish in Jerusalem down and put it to an end and put it to bed. Vespasian becomes the emperor of the entire empire. while he is stationed in Alexandria. And Alexandria is, of course, in... Yes, thank you for not saying Virginia. That's right, it's Egypt. So I'm afraid somebody's going to say Virginia tonight because, it's so close in proximity. So Titus goes to Jerusalem under the orders of his father, the emperor of Rome, and begins his encampments. And he sets his encampments up, and guess where he sets them up? He sets them up exactly where we read, between Jerusalem and the ocean. He sets encampments up on the Mount of Olives, and he surrounds the city of Jerusalem with the might of the Roman Empire. And he sends your favorite Jewish historian, Josephus, in to negotiate, because what happens whenever John and Simon see that Rome is knocking on the door of Jerusalem, they look at each other and say, we got to put our differences aside and band together. So then John lets Simon and his men into the temple, and they barricade themselves up. Josephus goes in to try to cut a deal. And this is the deal that Titus sends Josephus with. If you will cease and desist this nonsense of a civil war, bow the knee to Rome, we will leave the temple alone, let you resume your sacrifices, and let you go ahead and head back to your homes, and this will just be the end of it. Because there's no way. This is a very much... do y'all like American history? Everybody likes American history in here, right? You know the Alamo, right? Where they were surrounded on all sides. This is the scenario for John and Simon barricaded in the temple. This is the Alamo at Jerusalem. They're not getting out of this one alive if they fight. Well, John, being the jolly good fellow that he is, that I've just described for you, who is eat up and drunk with greed and power, says, why, of course we'll never surrender. And here's how he convinces his bloodthirsty, plundering, rapist army to stay with him. He promises them that if they will fight with him, he will give them land parcels all throughout Jerusalem and the hill country there. The problem is, nobody stopped and raised their hand and said, well, what good will land do if the Romans come in and crush us and kill us all, right? Which is what eventually happened. To tell you what happened next is, remember, the temple's already damaged from the Civil War before Titus and the Roman army rolls into town. It doesn't take long for them to finish off and capture both John and Simon. They immediately execute Simon, and John meets his demise not long after that. And then rumor spreads all throughout the Roman army that when they built the temple in Jerusalem, they used gold in the mortar. So you know what every Roman soldier did that day after they won the victory? They went over to the temple and they began pulling it apart, stone by stone. Doesn't that sound familiar to you? Somebody said 40 years earlier, before these events, that no stone would be left unturned and on its own. Who said that? Didn't Jesus say that? Let me remind you, right? If you have your Bible, you can turn with me and look. Jesus said in Matthew 24:2, 40 years earlier, but he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Josephus said, the right of the Jewish wars actually says the Romans, willing to extend peace to the Jews in their Jewish insurrection, but ultimately it was John who was responsible for so much of the bloodshed, and also to him personally responsible for the ultimate demise of the temple in Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting? They tore it down themselves. Now, so you can kind of see why I lean towards this being a type of Antichrist to come. This man would have uttered blasphemies because he lived a blasphemous life. Quick observation here too, when he went into the temple, he used the gifts that Rome had even given Jerusalem and that the people had given to the temple. He used it in profane ways, just like Nebuchadnezzar did whenever he ransacked the temple. He was no different than the pagan overlords that came in. He just happened to be of Jewish descent. All right. Then there's a chapter division. In the time shall arise Michael. Now we've seen this guy before in Daniel, right? What do you remember of him? Sorry I couldn't make it to you. I was busy battling the prince of Persia. Remember that? We talked about that in spiritual mapping and all that nonsense. Remember that lesson we had that one night? It says here, Michael will arise, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never seen since there was a nation till that time. At that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Now, many have made an argument that verses 12, 1 through 3 are at the end of time, and they may be correct. It may very well be at the end of time, but it also may apply to the same time period. If you think about this kind of a ransacking, this kind of a pillaging, this kind of rape, and this kind of blatant sexual immorality in the streets of Jerusalem had not been seen prior to this time. It was a time of great distress on God's people. And it was a time where, it was a time unparalleled before it. Also reminds me of Daniel chapter 12, right? Daniel chapter 12, Revelation chapter 12, if you want to flip over there for just a moment with me. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant, was crying out in birth pains and in agony giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, whose 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and cast them to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is able to rule all the nations, a rod of iron. Her child was caught up to God and to his throne, and the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. This is a prophecy that is given here. I think that many times what we have done is applied Daniel chapter 11 and 12 to the second advent of Christ, the return of Christ at the end of time, which we're waiting for. Right? Advent just means the coming of. So the first advent we celebrate at Christmas time, Jesus came. The second advent is when he comes in judgment. I think probably makes sense with Daniel 11, given how the historicity aligns with what Josephus' records are, that these prophecies may pertain to the first advent. There's another verse that's a bit strange. I don't know exactly what to do with it, but I think this is my best guesstimation on what to do with it in Daniel chapter 12. There is this verse here that probably is the strongest argument for applying this to the second advent, about the saints being killed and then being resurrected. Let's see if we can find that. Maybe I have it marked here. Where are you? There you are. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. 12. All right. And then verse 12. Everyone whose name was not written in the book. Verse 12. Back in Daniel. Many of those who slept in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some shall to everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above. And those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. So this is the verse people point to and say, see, this is obviously the second advent. This rings like the voice of the martyrs in Revelation, where they say, how long, Lord, will you wait to vindicate us? And that may be right. That may be the correct interpretation. But there's also an interesting event that happens in Christ's first advent, right? Do you remember which gospel records that when Jesus died, something unusual happened? Do you remember what that was? Graves popped open, and the dead came back to life. And they walked around and testified, right? I have always thought that was strange. The best Old Testament connection that I can make for that happening is probably right here in Daniel chapter 12, what we're looking at here. So I think Daniel chapter 12 signaling here the first advent and one of the events accompanying the first advent of Christ in that moment. Now, I could be wrong about that, but I think that's probably the best application I can pull over there. Verse 3, and those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who might turn to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Now, I've given you a really fast history lesson, tied it over some to the New Testament here. I will tell you, one of the things that fascinates me and why I think this is probably the same thing is because of Luke. We just finished Luke. Luke 21:20. Jesus prophesies to his listeners about a time of distress that is coming. And he tells them, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, well, that sounds real familiar, doesn't it? You will know that its desolation is near. So he's saying this to listeners who would have most likely been alive when Titus rolls into town and ransacks Jerusalem. Okay? Let those who are in Jerusalem flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. Remember where I said they like to go? Where do they like to go? They like to go to Egypt. And what's Jesus saying here? Can't go to Egypt. Titus had cut off the route to Egypt. Egypt's not an option here when Titus rolls into town. He's already thought about that, and he's already cut that route off. So Jesus says what? Go the other way. Head to the mountains. Right? For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in the days for the pregnant woman and nursing mother. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And I think we can all agree that Titus and his men are one, Gentiles, and two, trampled the temple to nothing. So, history actually records that whenever Rome rolled into town, the Christians that were living in Jerusalem of that day remembered the words of Luke 21:20 and following, and they did run for their lives, and tens of thousands of believers' lives were spared because they remembered what Christ said. Isn't that fascinating? Many who sleep in the dust, I think that's faithful martyrs more than likely. Those who have insight will shine like stars. What does it all mean for us? What does it all mean for us, Pastor? It's been a nice history lesson and a filling in a prophecy. It means a few things, right? One implication is this. We will always face times of distress while living on this planet. We will always face times of distress while living on this planet. There is not going to be a magical time where there's absolutely no distress anywhere to be found. As long as we wait for Christ and we wait for his second advent and coming, distress will follow God's people. Paul talks about us being lights in a perverse and dark generation, right? And here in this passage tonight, it says it as well. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. What is the need for believers to do in this time as we, one, expect hard times. It's two, to shine with the truth and the confidence of the gospel. When people live in the twisted and perverse generation that we live in now, they need lights to see, and they need lights to clearly point them to Christ. So we shouldn't expect carpets to be rolled out. We should expect times of distress like the Maccabean War, like the Civil War in Jerusalem, like whenever the temple is upended. I think that we sometimes don't make that as clear as we should. You know, the amount of Jews that died in this whole episode, some historians estimate 1.3 million. Minimal of 100,000 Jews were killed in Jerusalem during all this mess. I'd say somewhere in between is probably the correct number. God is in control is always another lesson that we pull out from Daniel. All right, questions or comments here on tonight's lesson? So, who do you think? Big A Antichrist in Daniel 11 or good old John who ended up destroying the temple in 70 A.D.? I don't know. I lean towards John, but who knows? Well, flip a coin. Yeah. You tell me. So, you tell me. All right. Let's move our attention to prayer. Any others? What's on here? Yes.
I noticed some of you think I live on the Trinity, but had someone from NAF last night. There's a pilot by the name of Ryan Kohr, Koher, and he's been taken captive in Mozambique. He's got a young wife, two small kids, and they've got them out of Mozambique and they're back here. This is not unusual. It happens to be another time when Christians have been taken hostage, stories have been made up, people have been put in jail, and they ask for prayer and fasting. And as I thought about that, well, and Jessica Peppers was very close friends with Jimmy and Bobby Peters. But as you think about these people, these are part of the people that are sharing the gospel today and are paying the price. We have no idea when they get out. Now, it's not been mentioned in the mainstream yet, but given the right circumstances, they are going to put it out in the mainstream. So just pray. If you've got young people in your life or kids and what have you, we've been involved in at least one of these overseas. Probably the thing that I'll probably ever remember is a couple days before Christmas, and I go to see the little boy, and he says, "My daddy's in prison." And if he didn't feel bad before that, he probably did. So the guy's name is Ryan.
Ryan Koher. Kohar. He's a pilot.
Yeah, see, they've got in with a contract. They're in a country that is not Christian friendly, and so they've been taking teams. And evidently, somebody played some cards, and I've had this happen to some other people where they framed them, and then you're left to try to figure out how to get out.
Anybody else?
You
did.
There are no mission trips to Haiti right now. There's about 90 gangs, and the whole country is in chaos. The only thing getting in from the outside is what missionary men can get in and get to where they need it.
90 Haitian gangs. Yep. They all like to. There's a lot of hustling going on down there. Was when I was there, and there wasn't. We got out right before I think it started getting bad. But yeah, I thought I was going to get stuck because I was sick trying to come back. I was afraid I was going to get sent back. But all right, any others? I have one I'll add for you. So I went to the Tennessee Baptist Convention 2 weeks ago. Thank you for your support and helping that happen. I went to the Denver Send. So Denver is a Send city that Tennessee Baptists have partnered with. They're looking for churches to be in partnership with some churches in Denver. There's like a corridor of interstate there in Denver. I don't know if I said this on Sunday morning. I may have. And looks to me like it'd probably take you 45 minutes or so, 45 minutes to travel it. And there are more people on that kind of corridor stretch of interstate, same population number as the entire state of Alabama. And there are just a fraction of the churches that are there to reach people. And so they're begging for church planters. They're asking for partners to be in there, contemplating maybe going on a visit out there. Apparently flights are pretty cheap from Asheville to Denver, and it's direct flights. So that also works to our advantage here in the state where we are. You'd be praying for that. Something I learned about Denver is that Denver's teen suicide rate is 3 times higher than the national average. So their teenagers are killing themselves at a rate 3 times higher than anywhere else in the United States. Isn't that crazy to think about? It's a city that is, if you're very familiar with it, it's very liberal in their policies. You know what I mean? Very what people would call left-leaning or progressive, and very much lacking in hope of the gospel. But the people are open to the gospel there. You know, I've heard a lot of stories of people coming to Christ, and a lot of transient community there. A lot of people moving from a lot of different places. So anyhow, different world than where you live. Even though they're mountain folk, they're a different type. He planted up there, yeah. He's one of those Sin City churches, yeah. Yep, that's true. Okay. Well, let's have a word of prayer, and I've got a Building and Grounds Committee meeting here in about 5 minutes, so we need to be dismissed, and some of you will be going to prayer meeting or to choir practice. Who'd like to dismiss us in prayer tonight? Into the Jerry, is that okay?